Introducing our first speaker for today. Dan Horvath is a project planning analyst lead on the Initiation Center of Excellence team at Progressive Insurance. In this capacity, Dan facilitates project benchmarking, performs data analysis, and produces project estimates based on the data. Dan has a background in application development, project management, and software metrics, including function point analysis. He has written articles, taught courses, and presented papers on project management and functional sizing and metrics, including presentations at ISMA 7, ISMA 10, and ISMA 14. Prior to joining Progressive, Dan was a senior consultant at QP Management Group and has worked at Electronic Data Systems and General Electric. Dan has been using the SLIM suite of tools on a regular basis for the past 5 years, although his experience extends as far back as the 1990s. Dan Horvath maintains project management professional and certified function point specialist credentials. So with that, I'll let Dan get started.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Thanks, everyone, and congratulations to QSM on 40 years. That's really great. I think I've been around for a lot of that, and it's good to be here, and just glad to be here to present. I appreciate this opportunity. If you want to improve predictability, agility, and speed of delivery, you might do this by first gathering project historical information, estimating based on that, planning your work based on those estimates, and then doing that work. Notice the emphasis on better. I'm saying using project historical information to produce better estimates. Too far there. You've heard some of these before. Those who don't know history are destined to repeat it. That's attributed to Edmund Burke. The definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. That's attributed to Albert Einstein. We hope to learn from that history and to make improvements so that we can get some different results, hopefully better ones. And Steve McConnell has that historical data and project data are both tremendously useful and can support creation of highly accurate estimates. I like quotes. You'll find others throughout the presentation. I hope you do too. This presentation is derived from one I did at an ISMA conference a couple of years ago. I've made some updates to it, and I was going to actually say that I've leaned it out a little bit, but I might want to say I've slimmed it down. I'm going to talk, this is what we'll be talking about, is equal opportunity benchmarking. Benchmarking is our way of gathering, collecting the project historical data. And we apply sizing to that, and we also apply sizing when we do the estimates. We get started with estimation templates, so I'll talk about that. Making use of the data is actually doing the estimate. And I'll ask the question, is Scrum or any Agile-like methodology any different? The short answer is yes, it's different, but only in some ways. And then I'll ask, how well does it all work? Short answer is, works pretty good. Industry data is available. QSM will gladly supply it to you, but you're better off to use specific organizational historical data instead. If you've got your own data, you can certainly apply that, and I think it's more appropriate and more useful. And benchmarking, again, is a way to to gather that data. Look at the definition of benchmarking. It means to evaluate or check something by comparison with a standard. I'm going to skip to the next bullet for a second here. We gather and we store information, but we also evaluate it and compare against the project historical data to, with the other information that's already there in that historical database, which is, of course, SLIM Data Manager in our case. In other words, we're doing two things. We're gathering the data, but we're also reporting on it. We can say that this data that we're gathering, it either where it fits in the historical data. I recommend benchmarking as many projects as we can. We can always take subsets of that data when we want to apply it, but generally speaking, the more the better. To do an estimate or to create a template for an estimate, you can use any subset. It can be as few as one or two projects, or it can be as many as you can get. Again, the more the better, but sometimes you want to get more specific, and it may be perfectly appropriate to use a very small subset. Some data is available from project management database, such as MS Project, but that doesn't tell the whole story. The biggest part of the story is size, and that's not in that project management database. You've got to get that in some other way. My organization does it by interviewing the project team. We've got to somehow figure out that size, and there's multiple ways of doing that. We'll get into that in just a moment. There may be other sources of the data as well. Some organizations have a separate database of things like requirements or stories or story points or things like that, that you can also gather information from. What you see at the bottom right is a profile of the different phases of a project and the full-time equivalents by month for some of those phases. And that's the type of detail that we need to gather. Getting even further into that detail is some of these types of metrics that we want to get. Size, and I'll be drilling down even further into size in just a moment, but that can be in terms of requirements, stories, what we call story cards, lines of code, function points, and I'll get into some of those common denominators of how to store this information. Effort in terms of hours, work, person, months. When you ask someone how big was that project, usually they'll tell you an effort, and that's sort of equivalent to, if somebody asks how far it is from New York to Washington, they might tell you 4 hours, and that's a different way of answering the question. But in terms of effort, is of course important, and again, when a lot of people in my organization think of effort as the size, and it's not. Another type of data that we collect, of course, is the time. How long did it take in calendar months? And that, of course, is one of the size and effort and time are all part of the calculation for productivity in the SLIM suite of tools. Our organization also collects defect information by severity, and SLIM Data Manager has some nice ways of storing that. Staffing by phase. That's getting into more of the detail, the full-time equivalents per month throughout the life of the project, and that actually is by phase and by month. And I say additional detail, such as, and actually a lot of this is actually by phase, so the effort, the duration, the staffing are all actually stored by phase in Slim Data Manager. The number of requirements or story points might or might not be how you're calculating the size. Even if they're not used, you may want to store those separately as different metrics. But even if you are using them for size, you may want to, again, store them separately. You can use multiple sizing methods for a project. In some organizations, stories and requirements may be equivalent, so you may be able to say one or the other and store them both as the same metric. And finally, I want to say that you might want to also include some qualitative project assessment factors, and for that I'm going to go to the next page. There's a couple of ways of doing this as custom keywords, which is one of the newer additions to Slim Data Manager, or user-defined variables and custom metric definitions. So user-defined variables are for use of calculations of the other metrics, so things you can put together for a variable that you want to use. And down at the bottom, you see some of the data you might want, some of the custom metrics that you might want to add. And the example here is scope. You might want to, as part of the interview process, we can ask the project team, project manager, or whomever, how was scope managed throughout the project? Was it understood well at the beginning of the project? Was it managed well with whatever change requests that occurred throughout the project? And you can assign a numerical value to that. In this case, we've got -5 to +5, but you can use these values any way you want, and possibly do some deep dive analysis on things like, for example, for projects where scope was poorly defined, how was the productivity on those? So we can do that kind of analysis on that information once we have it. So that's an option that you can do as you're gathering this data and interviewing the project team. Consistency is important when you do things like this, and that's why it's important to maybe just asking people and making sure that the answers that they're giving are consistent with the way others are answering it. And that's part of the art of the whole thing. Here's an example of some data manager data. Of course, this view can be configured any way you want to, but this is one way you might consider doing it, having a project name and the business case ID, which is a unique identifier, the preparer, the date, the effective implementation unit. So that's our sizing method, our sizing unit. I'll talk about that in a minute. The life effort, so the entire effort for the entire project, and the duration for the entire project. And again, there's further detail behind these things by phase. And the productivity index value that's based on all of these other metrics. the construction and test effort, which is some subset of the life effort. The number of requirements, again, that might be a separate metric, even if you're sizing it based on something else. And what we call the domain, or that could be like the business area, that type of thing. And now I'm going to talk about sizing, and the whole slim suite of tools is based on size, and really any sizing methodology, any estimation method is always going to be based on size. There's no way to get around that. So that's why I fooled with the first quote there. Vince Lombardi said, winning isn't everything, it's the only thing. I'm saying sizing isn't everything, it's the only thing. Size is a major driver of duration and effort. And it can be based on a lot of different methods, a lot of different ways of determining size. It can be source lines of code, and that may not be quite as practical as it used to be, but it's still a sizing methodology, and it's kind of the basis for everything. Even if you're not even considering lines of code, it's still the lowest common denominator here. Function points, that's the industry standard or the standard way of measuring size. And of course, it only applies to software development projects. Story points, or stories, or story cards, and problem may be very accurate within a project team, but may not be so consistent outside of teams. In my organization, stories are fairly consistent across the board, but story points are not. And that may or may not be the same case at other organizations. Components. This can be a homegrown thing. You might have things like screens and reports and files and databases and things like that. And then you can even apply relative sizing within that, and you can get some sort of modified functional sizing. It's a little bit like function points, not quite as rigorous, but it may fit the bill. And again, it's more oriented towards software development project, although you can come up with infrastructure type components as well. So that is possibly an advantage there. A number of requirements. I mentioned earlier that requirements can be considered equivalent to stories, at least in some organizations. And then I talk about complexity points. This is another homegrown measurement of complexity and size, but this is more by product than by the physical component that you see in a manifestation of some software. Sizing should be usable at any point, as simple as possible, but robust enough for most types of projects, as consistent as possible, and stored in consistent units. So the consistent units that my organization uses is called implementation units, and they're equivalent to lines of code, but of course some projects don't necessarily have any lines of code, or it's very hard to derive them. But that same level of detail would be implementation units. And we can convert any of these other things like function points or stories to those units, to those implementation units. But it's basically dimensionless other than that. The consistency is very critical. It's critical for both the benchmarking as we're gathering the data, and you're going to see that it's going to be critical for estimation as well. So hopefully I've impressed everyone here that sizing is important. And now I'll talk about estimation templates. Again, QSM does supply them, but if you've got your own project history, it would behoove you to create your own templates. You don't have to, because you could just go right from the history to create an estimate, but a template will provide a way to get started. We've got some standard ones I'll talk about. You can incorporate the actual specific project history from that benchmarking that we've done, not previous estimates, as well as trends and other tuning. A misconception is, at least in my organization, is that when we do an estimate using the slim suite of tools, that we're creating this estimate based on a previous estimate. In other words, there's a misconception that our project history is the estimates that we've done, and it's not. It's really the actual data that from the projects as they've completed. You can base an estimate on a previous estimate, but that's not what we're talking about here. The templates can be based on really anything you want: a work type, a platform, development or a deployment methodology, et cetera, et cetera. I'll talk about this in a little bit more detail here in a minute. You can create a template at any time. You can update them at any time. My organization has some basic ones, and we refresh those twice a year, and that's just the way it's worked out the best for us. We apply the most current history, of course, which is what you'd want. We throw out the old data when we create new, or when we update the templates, and this is critical. This is important for our organization, that we use only the most recent data, the last couple of years, and it might be in some cases. But for other organizations, it may be better to have all the history applied, or more of it. So it's a preference. But if your work types are changing, and if your methodologies may be changing, it may be better to discard older history. Which ones do we use? One we call infrastructure apps is things like software upgrades and that sort of thing. Technology infrastructure is more of an emphasis on the infrastructure itself. Enterprise, which are the larger projects that are taking many facets, or a big part of the organization itself. And then discretionary, a little bit smaller, but also development projects that are discretionary in nature. And then we can have others by platform or business area or methodology. I'll get into methodology in just another minute, or in some other areas, like telecom for us crosses different methodologies and platforms. So you might do it that way. You can slice and dice this information any way you want, and that's really handy. And now we've got one in our organization. We've got one for Scrum, which is again, I'll discuss how the iterative approaches like Agile or Scrum might be different from other ones. The data, once you've got it, you can create those trend lines, and in this case, there's can't quite read it, but there are trend lines for perhaps the discretionary data and the infrastructure data and the enterprise data, and the array of dots there, of course, are the projects in your project historical database. This might be the most useful slide, at least to some of you. This is how to create your own template, and it's more of a checklist than a cookbook, because it still doesn't go into all the details, but it's sort of a way to do this, and just step by step what you might do if you wanted to create your own template. You could actually use this for just creating a SLIM estimate, directly from the data as well. But because again, remember that the estimates are the templates are just SLIM estimate files anyway. You create a trend, the trends using SLIM metrics based on that full SLIM data manager file. I should mention this is my organization's methodology. Yours may vary, but this is, you take that whole SLIM data manager file and you create these trends using SLIM metrics from that data, and that's where you're doing the slicing and dicing. SLIM metrics enables you to put a lot of different criteria on a particular, when creating a particular trend. Create the SLIM. So then after that, what our organization does, we create SLIM data manager subsets to import into SLIM estimate, and that's the pieces, and so that provides the project history within SLIM estimate, and there you actually do have to have the specific data that you want to show in that SLIM estimate when you're comparing a specific estimate against project history. And now you're going to get into SLIM estimate, and you can start with an old template or anything, any SLIM estimate file. And from here on, now we're in SLIM estimate, and number 4 there says import the new trends from SLIM metrics, and that'll get them into that SLIM estimate file, and then you set the primary trend group to that, update the name of the template in SLIM estimate, then load the historical projects from that specific, that subset of the SLIM data manager file. Then set the historical tuning factors, and that's something you can do in SLIM estimate. There are several different factors you can set based on that history data that you've just imported. In the solution, there's some specific things that we would do if we were creating a template in the solution assumptions panel. We're setting the date, the high-level planning, duration and effort values, implementation warranty duration, also the construction and development overlap. Some of this stuff is set by the historical tuning factors, but you can even still override it here. Refine and adjust the resources, costs, and skills. That's some of the real nitty-gritty stuff that you do in SLIM estimate. You're setting up those roles and how the skill allocation values are in each phase of the project. And in the process, we look at the total value. So, as you make specific changes within a phase, you're going to see what the impact, you need to keep flipping over, or I do anyway. I need to keep flipping over to see how you're coming out as the total percentage. For example, you may want a quality assurance percentage of the project being about 10%, but if you're, you want to, your QA role may be more than that in some phases and less than that in other phases, and fooling with those numbers, and then looking back and see what the impact is pretty important. And then for each template, do those steps 3 through 9. Now let's do an estimate. I'm going to make use of that data. You pick the template, of course, it's based on your type of project. It may not be you may have to actually apply some experience to that, because, for example, you may have a very large project that's considered an enterprise project, but yet it fits better with the infrastructure apps templates, or vice versa. There might be some intelligence put aside there. And also, you could, of course, change the template for as you begin your estimate. To start applying some differences anyway. And even once you do that, once you pick a template, you may want to use some more specific trend data. So according to my cookbook there, you're going to import a trend, but you may want to even import another specific trend for example, maybe just a business area, so that you can show more than one trend line, or apply that kind of data as you're doing the estimate. When we perform an estimate, we look at what are the constraints of the project. There may be a duration constraint, or maybe we only have a certain number of resources that we can use. What is the scope of the project? In other words, MVP is minimal viable product. So there may be different scope options that need to be considered, different subsets of the scope, possibly. So that would, of course, be the size that you're going to use for the estimate. So all these options determine what options are going to be part of that estimate. And of course, there's the slim estimate output for the profile of the project. The methodology, this is not quite as much detail as I showed for the creating the template, and actually some of that could be used here as well, but this is just a little bit more of a cookbook, but at a higher level. So the development and unit test starting point, that's only for the technical resources, and then my organization, we add on what we call the core 4, which is the project manager, the technical solution owner, the requirements analyst, and the quality assurance analyst. So those 4 are actually added on. And of course, we build on the other phases too, like high-level planning, requirements and design, and the warranty. So we start with that construction test, and then we build all this up and around it. Large organization, usually, again, there could be a constraint on the staffing level, but if there's no constraint, our organization will use the average staffing, and by having that project history, you can do this. Same with productivity. You may need to adjust the productivity, but you can use the average for projects of that size. And the same thing with duration, unless duration is a constraint. After we start coming out with that sort of output, you can make adjustments, including the project manager allocation. In our organization, we just do it this way, we always want to have a full-time project manager or a half-time project manager, nothing else in between, or possibly more than one full-time. But we can do this inside the tool, but it's a little bit difficult, especially if the project phases overlap. So another way we can do it is by extracting the data into Excel and doing it there, because we do that anyway as we create a staffing forecast. And now I'll ask the question, is Scrum any different? Is Agile-like methodologies any different? Our organization doesn't have any or enough data to support differences in productivity for these different methodologies. So we can't really say, so therefore we use the existing history and trends. But the things that are different is we can say that we know that the phases and the manpower buildup are going to be different for Scrum and for these other Agile-like projects. And we can make for one thing, the manpower buildup index is not a factor, because we show, we have the standing team right from day one. And of course, high-level planning might be totally different. This one you see here shows about 4 weeks of high-level planning, but even that can be different. It could be 1 week of planning, but then other planning intervals throughout. And you can show that in a couple of different ways. You can show maybe 100% overlap between planning and a construction test. And we typically would have a very small warranty period for an Agile-like project. So we've developed a separate template like this, and we use that. And again, when we have further historical data to show different staffing levels and different, the main thing is productivity and size, then we can apply those to this template. Right now, again, we're using existing ones from existing projects. Oh, now we ask the question, how well does it all work? And I borrowed something from the Prairie Home Companion, where they used to say, all our children are above average. Here I'm saying all our projects are above average. At least that's what some people like to think. But we can show that differently, and in terms of the project historical data, this one is showing duration versus size. A little bit more than about how well it all works. Oh, actually, a word before that is, I think this is probably my last quote of the day. As Mark Twain was famously said, there are liars, damn liars, and statistics, and I'm actually using the same last word there, but I'm talking about outliers here. It just works well. But actually, this actually takes us back a couple of steps when we're talking about the project historical data. What do you do with an outlier? Well, you obviously see it there in the scatter plot. It's way above the line or way below the line. Actually, I think the technical definition of an outlier is 3 standard deviations away from the mean. But of course, you could say that you can define that any way you want for your organization. But what do you do with that data? Well, you leave them in there. My recommendation is you leave it in there. You don't have to apply it, though. When you create a template or create any slim estimate, you don't have to use that data. You can throw it out. But it's important to have it there, because it may be part of a trend and may be part of the way things are going. So you don't want to lose it. Getting back to how well it works, project historical data is valuable in providing evidence for estimates that are deemed risky. you get people telling you that I want an estimate and then I want it to be X number of hours and Y time frame. I want this estimate and I want it to look like this. So they're giving you the answer. And you can do that, but you can also show them in project historical data, where it may not be 100% realistic. And the results speak for themselves. In our organization, we've seen much improved predictability in both labor and duration, better scope stability. So we haven't seen fewer change requests, but the change requests are smaller in project we've estimated. So I think the term scope stability is probably a good accurate one. Improved accuracy for prioritization and sponsor decisions. So how do you prioritize projects? Of course, you want to look at the business need, of course, but here you get how much bang for the buck are you getting. In other words, it may be very desirable project, but yet it's very costly, and vice versa. It might be not quite as desirable, but you get it, well, I don't want to say for free, but very cheaply. So you can make those kind of business decisions. And better planning for slotting of the projects and for resource utilization. So how do you plan out those resources, and what do you see coming down the line? Our organization does all that. We're pretty mature in some of these ways. And that's it. Elizabeth, I am open to questions.
Great. And so we have a good one, a couple questions coming up. Do you use a mix of sizing methods in your organization? And if so, does it impact the trend lines creation and estimation process?
We do, but we've boiled it down to in a couple of different ways. We've used, let me go back to that slide, if I can here. I think it's safe to say that my organization has used all of these. But right now, we've come to a point where it's gotten, the consistency, as the question alludes, the consistency is of course important. Our organization stores everything in the same terms implementation units. So if we do size something based on function points, we'll apply a gearing factor to get it into the same units, the implementation units, and that we store the implementation units in Data Manager and in all the other slim suite of tools. Now, having said that, we've kind of gotten to a point where we're getting more into a couple of different sizing methods that work for a lot of different projects. So stories is one and requirements is another. And again, we've come and gone with a lot of these things. But the consistency is important, and if you've got, say, for example, one slim data manager file, then I think it behooves you to store it in the same units, and we do. If you've got different, if your organization has different data manager files, then yeah, you could get by with storing them in different units. But then, of course, your slim estimates will be based on, you'll want that to be based on the same sizing method as well. Okay?
I think that this is in regards to the question you're answering right now. Independence of technology is a possible goal? Not sure.
Yeah.
Not sure if I understood you, but.
Yeah, technology being, actually we do, my organization does all sorts of projects using this, different, I mentioned the different templates that we've got, infrastructure apps and technology infrastructure and enterprise, and so infrastructure apps is like I said, different applications and upgrades and things like that. In discretionary and enterprise might be all sorts of different development methods and platforms. So I think the general answer is yes, it works for everything, depending. And then of course when you want to apply the project historical data, you want to apply them as specifically as you can get. So if you're going to be doing, for example, you might be doing, some batch processing or something on a mainframe or something like that. You try to get that sort of data, so that sort of historical data when you want to apply it. And if you can't, you get as much other data as you can, and get as close as you can.
Great. So how has SLIM changed or evolved from the traditional large project sizing to the more agile but also scaled agile approach?
Well, the sizing is still the basis for everything, even regardless of the approach through agile, and that's sort of a problem that my organization still is struggling with, is trying to get a handle on the size, but it's always been a problem. So if you've got an agile group that is doing some amount of work, and you want to estimate that, you can estimate that we've got X amount of time, and what kind of work can we do in there, but it's still going to be based on size, and you've got to get a handle on that somehow. And it can be based on those other sizing methods that we talked about. And, and so the other thing, so the question also alludes to, smaller project. Yeah, so a lot of the SLIM estimates of projects, have been on larger projects. And if you're going to be doing smaller work chunks, however, whatever the methodology, it behooves you to have that kind of project history. It's interesting, my organization used to gather the data, the benchmark data. We had a limit on, we would not gather projects under a certain number of hours, a certain size in terms of effort. And now we are starting to see more, more of the smaller projects, and so we've gotten rid of that limitation, and now we're trying to get actually more of the smaller projects in our historical database. But again, the methodology is going to be important there too, as we go through here. So yeah, I think that hopefully that answers the question.
I totally agree that sizing is the only thing. We are currently using Scrum, and our metric is user stories. We apply the poker planning bottom-up technique, but we are also applying SLIM. Do you find a consistent and reliable gearing factor?
Yes, we have. We've done some analysis on stories, going from stories to what we call implementation units, and it's based on the type of project. The factor that my organization uses, and may or may not apply at all to anybody else, is 150 for as a gearing factor for all other projects except for enterprise projects, and there we came up with 300. Again, we came up with these numbers based on looking at, actually doing a deep dive on the data, and it's funny that it just happened to work out with 150 and 300, but for us, again, your data may be different, but I think you have to do that. You have to do that kind of analysis to say, what kind of gearing factor you should apply to get to the implementation units to make all the data consistent and line up. And we've been real consistent with that afterwards. And now we're getting to a point with some of the smaller and some of the iterative projects like Scrum and Agile that we're starting to think about applying some different factors. But again, we recently did do some further analysis on those, and we're actually still good with those same gearing factors.
How has SLIM contributed to your Scrum work?
Well, once again, we're kind of just beginning. I mean, we've had Scrum for a while. We've had iterative approaches before that. We've done things with Agile. So it's not really new to the organization, but it is new to the way we're estimating to some of those projects. In other words, we haven't always used the SLIM suite of tools on them. And it really helps to do as many of them as quickly as possible, and get them into the SLIM data manager. But I mentioned that template that we do have. This is again fairly new to us. Trying to get back to it here. But the main thing is, of course, the planning. You know, where does the planning come in? And it actually isn't necessarily like you see it here, but the and having that standing team. And I think I mentioned earlier that you we haven't been able to make assumptions about the productivity, although it's been starting to look pretty good. But as of now, we're using existing trends for productivity and that kind of thing. Now the staffing level, like I said, they can tell us what the staffing is, and we can apply that. So that's, hopefully that answered the question. Well, you know, I may not be the best person to answer this question, but we are working with this, and we're working through it.
How many projects have you captured historical data for?
It's in the 300s. I can't tell you exactly, but it's in the 300s. So we've been doing it for several years now. I want to say about 3 or 4 years of data, and we've gone even further back before that as well, but kind of steadily for the last 4 years or so. Yeah, that 300 projects is pretty good across the board, except again for some of the newer stuff we don't, you know, a lot of the I keep talking about it when we get more data, and it's always that way. You're always waiting for the next data, but there's so many projects in flight now, and we just got to wait till they complete to get them in there.
Quick follow-up to that, 300, excellent. How large is your team?
The people actually working with the SLIM suite of tools, we call ourselves the Initiation Center of Excellence. We're in the EPMO here at Progressive. It's varied, but there's maybe about 5 of us doing the actual this kind of work. But it varies. There's some that come and go.
I think, and I'm not sure if I'm skipping around a little bit, but
Okay.
Can you please explain what you mean by enterprise projects?
Just they span the entire basically large projects. They span the entire organization. They may go across several business areas. That's usually really the criteria, not necessarily the size, but just the fact that it spans. There may be several business areas involved. You know, maybe most of the work is in one, but the fact that we've got to get other business areas involved doing some work. That would really define what I would call an enterprise project.
How independent is your estimating group from the IT dev organization?
This could vary a lot. Some organizations have an estimation center of excellence, and they do all the estimates. And I've seen that in back in my consulting days. again, I mentioned the Initiation Center of Excellence, so the project initiating, and there is part of the project management organization here. An Estimation Center of Excellence may or may not be as well. Now, in my organization, the project management organization is part of the information technology part of the company. May or may not be, though, because there are business-oriented projects as well. So that doesn't have to be the case either. I gave a presentation at an ISMA conference about an estimation center of, I'm sorry, an initiation center of excellence, but there I did talk about an estimation center of excellence as well, and whether or not that might be part of project management organization, and whether or not that might be part of information technology is really some organizational questions that you might want to answer for yourself.